I gotta punctuate it. I said I loved your shirt, but behind your back I said I hate it. May lightning strike me down if I lied, may no one be around when my tongue's untied. Everybody says it's okay, all the little things I say with my big fat mouth. La 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 la. With my big fat mouth.
My big fat mouth gets me in trouble.
So how many of you are willing to admit that you have a big fat mouth? All right, pretty much everyone. Good. We have an honest service today. How many of you would be brave enough to say that your spouse has a big fat mouth? Good. I mean, some of you raised your hands, but the majority of you didn't, which is a good move. But we're starting this new series called My Big Fat Mouth, and the reason is a couple of reasons. One is the Bible has a lot to say about the words that are coming out of our mouth, our tongues, how we talk to other people, but also, I don't know about you, but my mouth has gotten me in trouble over the years. Anyone else? Yeah, we've all said things that have gotten us in trouble. I remember when I was in third grade, my mom was picking me up from school, and I'll never forget the hallway, the feeling of this. We're walking out of school, and for some reason she was in the building with me, and I realized that I forgot to put something in my backpack that I needed for that night, and I said a word that my mom didn't appreciate. And it was a 4-letter word. I won't tell you which one, but in all honesty, I didn't even know it was a bad word. I was a pretty innocent kid, but my mom let me know that it was a bad word, and I didn't know if I'd make it to 4th grade at that moment. I remember when Danielle and I were dating, probably 9 or 10 years ago. We were in our first little fight, and I said these words to her. I said, "Honey, just chill out." As soon as those words left my mouth, I was just praying that she didn't hear them, or like I was looking for a way out of that. She did hear them though, and I've never said those words to her again. I learned my lesson. Or how about this one? And maybe you've done this before too, but I think I've done this a couple times. I've texted something about someone, but I sent it to the person I was actually talking about. Has anyone done that? Like, talk about a hard lesson learned, like trying to get yourself out of that one. But the truth is, our words have gotten us in trouble. Our words will continue to get us in trouble. So during this series, we're going to look at ways where we can leverage the words we say to bring honor to God and to bring honor to others. Because whether we like it or not, our words are powerful. Our words are powerful. The writer of Proverbs, King Solomon, he said this in Proverbs 18:21. He said, "The tongue has the power of life and of death." Meaning our tongue, the words we say, can breathe life into somebody, or it can breathe destruction and death into somebody as well. And deeper than the actual words that are coming out of our mouths, I believe this is important because the Bible talks about how our words are directly connected to our heart. I mean, Jesus himself, he says this in Matthew 12:34. He says, "For out of the abundance," some translations will say the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And if you know anything about Jesus, you know that what he wants most is your heart. So if we're going to give our heart to Jesus, we also need to give our words and our mouths to him as well. So just to give you an idea of where we're headed during this series, next week we're going to talk about criticizing. We're going to talk about critical people. Some of you are probably already thinking about someone you want to invite next week because we all have critical people in our lives. The next week we're going to talk about lying. Then we're going to talk about gossiping. But today we're going to talk about complaining. We're going to talk about complaining and the heart issue because, again, our words are an overflow of what's going on in our heart. So what is the heart issue that causes us to complain? Now, complaining, and we know this, no one had to teach us how to complain, right? I think we just come out of the womb knowing how to complain. Too far, like we're just natural complainers. So, and by the way, if you're thinking like, Brian, come on, people don't complain that much. Here's just a little experiment for you. When you watch the Super Bowl later today, I want you to pay special attention to the wide receivers. If you don't know what that is, if you don't watch football, they're the ones that are catching the ball. Every time they don't catch the ball, this is what they do. They start complaining to the refs as if the refs caused them to not catch the ball. And if they do throw a flag, it's the defense complaining. If you don't like the call in your living room, it's you complaining. We are just natural complainers. And how is it that regardless of our circumstances, we always have something to complain about? How is it that we could be in the middle of the blessings of God, yet we still have something to complain about? What is it going on in our hearts that out of the abundance of it, complaining comes out of our mouths? So what I'd like to do today, I want to show you two passages of Scripture, one in the Old Testament, and then we're going to transition to the New Testament to see what the Bible has to say with complaining. And when I think about complaining and how it relates to the Bible, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the nation of Israel. If you're familiar at all with the Old Testament, the nation of Israel, which is kind of a central theme of the Old Testament, they were God's chosen people, but they were like great at complaining. They were complaining non-stop over and over and over. Pastor Rick refers to them as the whiners in the wilderness. They were just always complaining. And to give you a little bit of background about the passage we're going to read in just a second. So what you have to know about Israel is that they were in slavery in Egypt for 430 years. So for 430 years, they're regarded as little more, like barely more than an animal. They're just second-class citizens suffering in slavery. And then God, through amazing miracles, frees the people of Israel from the nation of Egypt. He frees them through, you probably heard the story of Moses and Pharaoh, and Moses going to Pharaoh saying, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh saying no. And after 10 plagues, Pharaoh finally decides to free the nation of Israel. About 30 seconds later, Pharaoh changes his mind and says, "You know what, I don't want to free them." So he sends the army of Egypt after Israel. And then God does this amazing thing. He parts the Red Sea, allowing over 1 million people to cross over safely through the Red Sea. He continually protects them. You read in the Old Testament that he provided for them clothes that never wore out. He made it so that even in their 40 years in the wilderness that they never got blisters on their feet, which I think is an underrated miracle in the Bible. I mean, I've prayed for that one before, especially in Disney World. I mean, over and over and over, God is providing for them. 2 times he provides water when there wasn't water. One time from water from a rock. A second time they're at a body of water that wasn't drinkable, and he makes this entire body of water drinkable for the nation of Israel. And then maybe one of the more famous ones is he provides manna, bread, food for the people of Israel every single day. Over and over and over, God provided, he protected, and he proved himself to the nation of Israel. But they continually do what I do so often, and what some of us struggle with so often. In the middle of the provisions and the blessings of God, they complain. Here's just one example in Exodus 14, 11 through 12. It says, they said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" I mean, you can almost just feel the complaining in their words. "What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the deserts." I mean, God continually proved to them that he would protect them, yet they didn't fully trust him. And this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a recurring theme in the Old Testament. Now, some of the complaining was directed at God, but some of the complaining was also directed to Moses and the other leaders of Israel. And I want you to look at this one time where the people are complaining against Moses, and I want you to look at Moses' response. He says this in Exodus 16:8. Moses said, "You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." So what if every time I complain about something, whatever it is, whatever I'm directing it at, what if every time I complain about something, I'm actually directing it to God? What if every time I complain about a job or our bosses or our calendars, we're actually complaining against God? What if every time we complain about our spouse or our kids or our mother-in-laws, we're actually complaining against God, or maybe even the food we eat? Or how about this one? The Wi-Fi being slow. And I say that because I complained about this one this past Friday. I was on the phone with Spectrum for 2 hours trying to figure out my Wi-Fi, complaining a lot. But what if every time I complain, I'm really complaining against the Lord? So what I want to do before we go any further in this message, I want you to think about this. I want you to think about what your biggest or your most common complaint is in the world right now. If you could summarize your biggest or your most common complaint, maybe just this week, what would that be? And I want you to write that in because I want you to look at this next statement through the lens of your biggest or your most common complaint. And by the way, we're not going to judge you because of your complaint. I'm not going to try to make you feel guilty. It would be way too easy for me to make you feel guilty about this because we all complain. And while you're doing that, while you're thinking about what your biggest complaint is, I'm just going to share a few that I had just this week. So this week, I complained about the weather. I'm sick of the weather in Buffalo, right? Monday and Tuesday, it was like 40 degrees, which means my yard is all muddy. And I have a dog, so that means my house is also all muddy. I complained about the weather and the mud this week. Speaking of mud, I complained about my driveway this week. We have a stone driveway, and I would love for it to be cement or concrete, but it's really long and it would be really expensive. So I complained about the muddy driveway we have this week, and right now we're dealing with potholes in our driveway. So I complained about our driveway this week. Speaking of potholes, I complained about the city of Lockport this week. Has anyone driven through the city of Lockport recently? It is like a war zone. Some of those side streets, you just think your car is going to fall apart. Speaking of cars, I complained about my car this week because Friday we had to take Danielle's car to the mechanic, and I love my mechanic. I trust him. He comes here. He does a great job, but there's like 100 things I'd rather spend my money on than paying the mechanic. Speaking of money, I'm just going to stop right there. See, we all complain. And again, the reason I want you to write something down or at least think of something is I want you to listen to this statement through the lens of your biggest complaint. And you could fill this in your notes. Is that every time I complain, and whatever that is for you, every time I complain, the enemy is taking the focus off of the goodness of God and onto myself. So this is how it works. Take whatever your complaint is. I'll use my first one, the weather. When the focus is on me, it's all about what I have to deal with. It's about the cold. It's about my muddy floors and the dog getting his feet all muddy. But when the focus is on the goodness of God, you know how my perspective is a little bit different? I didn't have to deal with a hurricane this year. I didn't have to deal with a flood in my house this year. It changes things because our focus is on the goodness of God. So what about you? See, I believe that one of Satan's strategies in our lives, and he has a lot of strategies to make us stumble, but I believe one of his best strategies is to make us think that we are the center of the world. And every time I think that I am the center of the world or the center of the story, you know what happens is a lot of pride, a lot of jealousy, a lot of greed and laziness, and a whole lot of complaining begins to sneak into my life. So what do we do about that? Again, we all complain. What do we do about it? How do we change it? So what I'd like to do now, I want to switch gears to the New Testament, and I want to read a few passages written by the Apostle Paul in the book of Philippians. So to give you a little bit of background about this passage we're going to read, Paul he was an apostle of Jesus. He followed Jesus. He wasn't always a follower of Jesus. There was a time where he wanted to wipe out Christianity, and then God, through a miracle, he reveals himself to Paul. Paul becomes a Christian, one of the greatest church planters of all time. Paul wrote the book of Philippians to the church in Philippi from a Roman prison. Now, what you need to know about Paul is that Paul's dream was to go to Rome. He always wanted to go to Rome to start a church. He wanted to go to Rome as a preacher because Paul understood if he could influence Rome, he could influence the world. So his dream was to go there as a preacher, but he ended up going there as a prisoner. We know that when he wrote this, Paul was in prison for 2 years in Rome. How they did this, and this will be important in just a moment, they would chain the prisoners to a Roman guard 24/7. So 24/7, Paul was chained to a Roman guard. He was in prison for doing the work of God. If anyone had a reason to complain, it was Paul. And if I was in Paul's shoes, I probably would have given in to that temptation to complain. Like, God, here I am doing the work that you called me to do. I'm preaching the gospel. I'm making a difference. Why did you let this happen? God, why am I in prison? I wanted to come here as a preacher, but I'm here as a prisoner. And God, this guard smells really bad, and now I'm chained to him 24/7. God, if you are who you say you are, why can't you do anything about this? So I want you to look at this verse, and I think because of Paul's situation, I think he speaks this with a little bit of authority. He says this in Philippians 2:14. He says, do everything without grumbling. Some translations will use the word complaining. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. See, I believe if Paul were here today, and if he were to give us some advice, I think his advice would go something like this, and you can fill this in. If you can change your circumstances, do something about it. If you can't change your circumstances, change your perspective. See, our inclination, my inclination in a situation that I can't control is to complain. It's for me to kind of have a pity party, for me to think that I'm the center of the story and I can't control this, so I'm going to complain. But Paul, rather than complain, he changes his perspective. And just so you can kind of have an idea of what his perspective was, look at this in Philippians 1, verse 12 through 13. Paul says, he said, I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me here has helped to spread the good news. What is the good news? The good news is the story of Jesus, his grace. He says it's all happened to me to help spread the good news for everyone here, including the whole palace guard, knows that I am in chains because of Christ. See, first of all, if Paul had a choice, I believe he would have gotten himself out of prison. If he had a choice, he would have been out of there, but he didn't have a choice, so he changed his perspective. He wanted to go to Rome to preach, but he was there as a prisoner, but rather than seeing that as an obstacle, Paul saw that as an opportunity. I mean, what do you think Paul talked to those guards about? Every 8 hours, a new guard chained to him. I mean, talk about a captive audience. He's telling them the good news about Jesus, to the point where it says the entire palace guard of Rome knows what Paul is about and knows what Paul believes. So how did Paul do this? See, I believe that Paul understood that he was not the center of the story. For Paul, Jesus was the center of the story. So Paul was chained to a Roman guard. My question for you this morning is, what are you chained to? What situation do you find yourself in that you would love to control, but you can't control? How can you change your perspective? What are you chained to, and how can you change your perspective? Is it a work situation? Maybe it's the people you work with or where you're working. Maybe it's a family situation or a financial situation. If you can change your circumstances, do something about it. But if you can't, change your perspective. So what are you chained to today? Many of you knew a woman named Joy Yowsi. Joy Yowsi, she attended this church for a long time, and I didn't know her as well as I would have liked to, but she was an amazing, amazing woman. Many of you know this, but Joy passed away just a few months ago, and if you would have asked her, what are you chained to? She would have said cancer. Now, if she had the choice to change her circumstances, you better believe she would have changed her circumstances. But can I tell you what? Joy had an unbelievable perspective on life. They had her memorial service in this room. This room was packed. And person after person would stand up, and they shared how Joy impacted their life. They told stories about how Joy would go into other patients' rooms and pray for them. She would offer them hope. She would share her story with them. She would talk to them about Jesus. I mean, I can't think of a more appropriate name for her than Joy. She had an unbelievable perspective because for Joy, Jesus was always the center of the story. It wasn't about her. It was about Jesus. So as we come to an end today, I want to give you one practical thing that we can do on a regular basis that will help us to change our perspective, and you can write this in, is that we change our perspective by remembering what God has done for us. By remembering what God has done for us. So back to Israel for just a moment. Like we said a little bit earlier, God, all of those provisions and ways that he provided for Israel, one of the ways he did that was through manna. He provided food for them for the entire nation every single day. And what's interesting is God told the people, he said, just take enough for that one day. Don't save up more in case it's a bad day or something. Just take enough for one day. And you see early on, the people of Israel, they ignored that and they tried to save extra manna. And the manna, every single day, if they saved some, it would go bad. Because God was teaching the people of Israel to trust God, that God would continue to take care of them. And then God gives Moses these instructions in Exodus 16:32. God tells Moses, he says, take an omer, which is about 2 quarts of manna, and keep it for the generations to come, so that they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt. Which is interesting because all the manna would go bad if they didn't consume it that day, but this manna God kept. He allowed it to stay good, so for generations and generations, they can look to that as a reminder that God provided for them. See, the significance of that is, and I believe that God understands that we get distracted so easily. We can be surrounded by the blessings of God and the provisions of God, yet we get distracted by our circumstances, and our focus comes off of the goodness of God and onto ourselves. And for a moment, we think we are the center of the story, and God understands that about us. He understood that about Israel, so he gave them this jar of manna to serve as a reminder. So my challenge for you today is to, when you're tempted to complain, is to pause and to remember what God has done for you. To remember the ways that he has provided for you. I believe when the going got tough for Paul in the Roman prison, I believe that he paused and he reflected on the goodness of God. The fact that the grace of God saved him. Even though he was in the midst of trying to wipe Christianity off the planet, the grace of God intervened and saved Paul. I believe when the going got tough for Joy, she would pause and she would reflect on the goodness of God. She couldn't change her circumstances, but she gave thanks for her family. She gave thanks for knowing God who loves her and took care of her. I mean, if you could have seen the face on Joy. She wanted to be here every single week, but she couldn't. But the weeks that she was here, she just, her perspective was different. She wasn't the center of her story. Jesus was the center of the story. So just like Israel had that jar of manna to remind them, we have a reminder as well. Communion has a way of putting things in perspective for me. I shared this with our worship team. We took communion as a team prior to church service today, and I shared with them that when you work full-time in ministry, things can get routine a lot. The things of church can get routine. But the one thing that I'm very careful that I never let get routine is taking communion. Because for me, it puts things in perspective. I can be complaining, I could be aggravated about my day, but when I take communion, it puts things in perspective. It reminds me that I'm not the center of the story, that Jesus is the center of the story. It reminds me that no matter how bad my day has been, that Jesus died on the cross for me, that he saved me in my own sin. He saved me. And it helps me to take the focus off of me and onto the goodness of God.